Hello, this is Anya Leonard, founder and director of Classical Wisdom. You are listening to Classical Wisdom Speaks, a podcast dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds. Today I'm speaking with Stephen Dando-Collins, the award-winning author of 40 books, including Rise of an Empire, on which the major motion picture 300, Rise of an Empire, was based. In today's episode, we discuss his most recent book, Caligula, the Mad Emperor of Rome, which delves into the true history of the notorious leader. But before we begin, a quick thank you to our Classical Wisdom Society members who make this podcast possible. If you would like to become a Society member and help support the classics, please go to classicalwisdom.com and click Start Here. Now, on to the imaginative rumors about Caligula, whether or not they are true, and if one can justifiably compare Caligula to Donald Trump.
Yeah, I talk about in Caligula the importance of the handshake to the Romans and how that follows through to the present day.
The importance of the handshake. I mean, can you explain that a bit more? I don't know this.
Yeah. In the final chapter of Caligula, I draw a comparison. Well, I don't draw the comparison. I assess the comparison that's been made by many commentators between Caligula and President Donald Trump. And one of the areas that I noticed with interest was the handshake of President Trump. Because as I tell in the story of Caligula, the handshake was very important to the Romans. It had started out thousands of years before the handshake as a form of greeting between two people, and they reach out the right hand to prove that they don't have a weapon in their hand. But by the time of the Romans, it was if you wanted to show deference to the other party or respect, you would yield the upper hand, and this is where that saying comes from, giving somebody the upper hand. You would extend your hand with the palm up so they could shake your hand with their palm down in the superior so-called position. And I was interested in looking at President Trump's handshakes. People like President Putin or President Macron of France, Mr. Trump often, when they have met over the last 2.5 years, would extend his hand palm up, yielding the upper hand to these people. Yet, when shaking hands with people like Theresa May, the British Prime Minister, or Angela Merkel of Germany, he would give them a straight up and down handshake. Now, I don't know whether that's conscious, and whether he's showing deference to these people, or I don't know. But anyway, it's an interesting comparison.
Now, you have said that you want to make comparisons between Caligula and Trump. I mean, do you think there is a lot of comparison? I mean, are they similar? Are they completely dissimilar? What role do they have in history?
Readers would need to read the whole chapter, but in many ways they're very different. Caligula became the third emperor of Rome at the age of 24. Donald Trump became president of the United States at the age of 70. So in those respects, they're very different. But then they had a very similar background. They both had very successful fathers who died before they came to power. Both had multiple wives and so on. Both were sports fanatics. Caligula was totally obsessed with chariot racing and actually raced chariots himself and built his own private chariot racing hippodrome. President Trump's obsession is golf and golf courses. But when we get to things such as policy, very, very different. And no real genuine comparison can be made. The made comparison was because I found so many others, commentators, making this comparison.
So Caligula, just as a general character from history, has probably one of the worst reputations of all. And you have mentioned in your book that you sort of discuss his position in history, whether he sort of deserved this treatment or not. I mean, was he as mad as they say?
By the end of his 4-year reign. It's amazing that somebody who was in power for such a short period has had such an impact on history. But we can blame Hollywood in part for that. And authors like Robert Graves. I'm a huge fan of Robert Graves' I, Claudius and Claudius the God, which became the British TV series in the 70s, I, Claudius. But they did stray from the truth. And Robert Graves was a great Roman scholar, so he knew he was doing it, but he was doing, changing history to make Caligula an absolute monster. By the end of his reign, but Robert Graves, for example, talks of Caligula when he's age 14, and says he's doing absolutely despicable things. Roman authors such as Suetonius, at that age, Caligula was absolute fear and of being bumped off, as his 2 elder brothers were, as his mother was, as his father seems to have been, and tells us that he was keeping his mouth shut and behaving himself impeccably, because he knew that both Sejanus, the head of the Praetorian Guard, and Tiberius, the emperor, and his grandfather household, and if he said one thing or took one foot out of place, he could end up being executed or forced to commit suicide. So his evil traits, his wicked traits, didn't come out until well into his reign. And he was hugely popular with all classes. And he gave a general amnesty to all people in prison or who had been exiled. He did all sorts of wonderful things. And but then he came down with a very serious illness, and was thought he wouldn't survive. And after that, his personality changed dramatically. And in the penultimate chapter of my biography, I discuss all the many potential medical reasons for that his change in mental state that have been put up by medical people over the years, and given to us by Suetonius and other authors tend to suggest that he may have had bipolar disorder, which tends to show itself by the time that people are 24 or 25. And this would explain some of his... he went from being very cowardly to being incredibly impetuous and brave, and these are extremes of bipolar. But he only got 3 hours sleep a night toward the end of his reign. There are so many other symptoms that match up with the known symptoms of bipolar disorder. And he'd had epilepsy as a child, and that can be a red flag for bipolar. And so there could be a medical explanation for some of his quite, as we see them, crazy acts, and cruel and capricious. And he also became very, very paranoid. He had every reason to be paranoid, growing up with all his family members being eliminated around him. And but that is another symptom of bipolar disorder, of suspecting anybody and everybody. And by the end, all those around him were so terrified of falling foul of him, they ganged up to assassinate him.
Yeah, I do sometimes fear that we've sort of romanticized some of the characters, or we almost want to make them more evil. And I mean, it comes back down to, again, how just some of these representations are, or if they really did all go completely mad. Because, there's certain accusations like calling somebody a poisoner or accusing them of committing incest. Sometimes these accusations were thrown out in order to defame somebody's character because they were so hard to prove. I mean, do you think there are times where people have sort of been unjustly treated by historians after the fact?
Caligula is a prime example. Tacitus said And Tacitus is our prime source for all the emperors of the first century. And the later emperors didn't have that kind of very talented and very thorough biographer. And this is why we know so much about those emperors of the first century, through Tacitus. But he said that many authors set out to cut down and defame the key emperors of the first century, including Caligula, Claudius, and Nero, and tended not to write the good things that they did. Tacitus was a key source, and he wrote that. And of course, we're very lucky that source has come down to us, because he quoted many other biographers that existed at that time, but whose works have disappeared. So, and even then, the key years of Caligula's reign have disappeared from Tacitus, the copies of Tacitus' work that come down to us. So we have to rely on Suetonius, who was a bit of a pulp fiction writer, and Cassius Dio, who was writing 150, 200 years after the events. So we're very much reliant on the reports that have survived, and many of them were quite biased.
Well, and I feel like that Caligula might be even more difficult emperor to write about because of the de facto damnatio memoriae, the damnation of memory, that after he was assassinated, I mean, people tried to systematically remove anything that he did. And I always think a good example of that is the ships that he created in Lake Nemi, that these amazing feats of naval engineering that, you know, with the wooden anchor and ball bearings, like inventions that we thought weren't created until Da Vinci. And yet these were just sunk to the bottom of a lake simply because they wanted to remove anything that had to do with Caligula. So, I mean, this was something positive. I mean, yes, maybe the way he probably incentivized engineers to come up with these things was less than kind, but the end result was absolutely amazing feats. And yet we wouldn't have known about these.
You say ball bearings.
Yeah.
It was assumed ball bearings weren't invented until only several hundred years ago, but here was the example of Roman engineers inventing ball bearings 2,000 years ago, and the ability that science disappeared for thousands of years. Caligula wanted to be considered an innovator, and I describe him as when he came into power, being the grandson taking over the family business from Tiberius, his grandfather, and full of innovative ideas. And there's no doubt that he encouraged engineers and scientists. He started work on then Rome's two biggest aqueducts, and massive constructions, which Claudius would later take credit for. And it was, you say that later generations removed all reference to Caligula. It started with Claudius. Claudius was lucky to survive Caligula's reign, and he said himself, he played the idiot deliberately to escape Caligula's wrath. But everything to do with Caligula was immediately destroyed. All the coin by Claudius's order. So all the coins that had Caligula's face on them were recalled and melted down. The vast majority of his edicts were repealed. Anything that he had constructed which had his name on or should have had his name on was removed, and so on. So his reputation was destroyed almost from the day he was assassinated. But I can imagine him in a frenzy of construction, surrounded by engineers, and telling them, I want these massive ships to float in Lake Nemi, and I want the statues of the goddesses to be able to turn to follow the rising and setting moon. And this is why the ball bearings were invented. I'm not suggesting he actually invented ball bearings, but he gave the engineering brains of the day the incentive to be as innovative as they possibly could.
And he was also sort of famous for doing some public reform as well. I mean, did he published how public funds were spent and helped after fires and abolished some taxes. I mean, there was didn't even restore democratic elections at the beginning of his reign. I mean, there was a couple of really positive, like, public initiatives even, not just the engineering that he managed to put forth.
Absolutely. Those first 7 months, it was almost non-stop. His initiatives, and of course his father Germanicus had been very, very popular with the Romans and had been cut down in his prime. He was the heir apparent, Tiberius's heir, and so the Roman people had great hopes for his children, that they would be as charismatic and as brave a soldier, and which Caligula never was. He never served in the army, unlike his father. He was a brilliant general. And that reputation even hung on until Nero's time. Nero was Caligula's nephew. And when he came to the throne, again, the Roman people said, the grandson of Germanicus has come to the throne. Thank heavens we're saved again. And again, he let them down.
You think they would have learned their lesson?
It's amazing. It's amazing. And for hundreds of years afterwards, Germanicus's birthday was celebrated by the Roman people. But you're right. You would have thought after Caligula, I would have thought that the family did not inherit the good traits of Germanicus.
And so, considering that so much of this evidence was destroyed and lost, what kind of research were you able to do for your latest book?
I had been researching Caligula's family for about 40 years by the time I sat down to write this book. Because I mentioned Germanicus, I write about him extensively in my earlier books, in the stories of the legions and his military campaigns, and also in a book where I discuss his apparent murder, called Blood of the Caesars. And I'd written about Nero and in a book called The Great Fire of Rome. So I'd skirted around Caligula and written. He was more of a supporting character, if you like, in these other books. So I felt that it was pointed out to me that Caligula was being likened to Donald Trump, and I was being asked by journalists, does it stand up? And so that started me thinking about looking at Caligula as a standalone book. And as I know, the Hollywood film, the 1979 Caligula movie, which was gory and sex-crazed, it was produced by Bob Guccione, the publisher of Penthouse, and he actually did a special edition of Penthouse in 1980 based on the movie. So he and his fellow scriptwriter Gore Vidal set out to make Caligula as sex-crazed and as horrific as they possibly could. So, and as I mentioned, Robert Graves, departed from the truth a little when telling us about Caligula. So I felt that there was an opportunity to set the record straight, if you will, and talk about both the good and the bad qualities of Caligula.
Thank you for listening to Classical Wisdom Speaks, a podcast dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds. Classical Wisdom Society members can listen to the entire podcast with Stephen Dando-Collins on classicalwisdom.com. For more information on Stephen's other books about Roman history, please visit stephendando-collins.com.